The thing about it is that, and I think you would agree with me on this. When you start to learn more about these techniques, it's hard to then unsee them happening all around you in all these
Sure.
different industries. Like, in
I
other words, we're not talking about, I'm going to say this, with all the respect in the world, what you're talking about is core human behavior, the things that make us like we all want to believe that we make rational choices, but at the end of the day, it's mostly our lizard brain that has evolved over time that has said, "Oh, if I do it this way, I usually don't get hurt, and I sometimes get more money if I do it that way." Like you just sort of, but then you start to realize, like, oh, that's the reason why. For example, when you're buying a car, sometimes these places will be like, "Okay, so if I get you that price, are you in?" And they'll get you to sign this thing, which is clearly not a contract, but they still try to get you to sign this blank piece of paper, and it really is just showing you commit, or that in your mind that you've committed to this thing, which is probably not the best example, but
Yeah, like I mentioned anchoring bias a little bit, but just anchoring bias, like a good example of that is, let's say somebody wants to sell you a television for $500. So there are two tactics that a person can use. One is they could just say this television is $500, or they can show you a television that's $1,000 first, then show you the $500 one. So when you see the $500 one after the $1,000 one, your mind is anchored on the price, $1,000, and you think you're getting a deal when you buy the $500 one. However, ultimately, that's what you wanted to sell it for in the first place. So it's like all the, by the way, everybody does this. All marketers and all companies use anchoring bias in order to sell. So if you're trying to sell to a patient, but not in a personal, not from a personal gain standpoint, but you want to sell them because you want them to buy into their home exercise program, you need to know how to negotiate with your patients and you need to understand anchoring bias.
it's not to go off topic on this. I was thinking about, we were actually just talking about a similar topic on this internally yesterday. And the example I used was 1-800 contacts. So I order my contact lenses online, and one of the examples I used with our team internally was I showed them I pulled up on my screen share my text messages from this company over the last 8 weeks. And what was interesting was, as it got closer to the end of the year, their text messages, their messages don't say buy more contacts, Paul. I mean, I guess if they were lazy, that's what they would do and whatever. But instead, it was tied to this idea of like, they were like, "Hey, Paul, you have 40." I'm making this up, but just off the top of my head, it was like, "Hey, Paul, you have $387 of benefits left in your FSA or your HSA. Don't forget to use it, before the end of the year. Like, you'll lose it if you don't." And all the language was really built around the way I explained it to my team is like, it made me feel like, or realize that very few of us would walk past $100 bill just sitting on a sidewalk. And
Right.
yet we will flippantly not show up to the doctor for whatever reason, maybe, and we'll justify it to ourselves. Oh, God, that meeting ran long, so I just couldn't make it to the appointment. Listen, it's not a big deal, Ari. I know we got 6 visits. Let's just get it done in 5. It's no big deal. But we justify it to ourselves. But if we realize that, I don't know, there's something to this idea that we talked about this internally, this idea that what if our own messaging as a product helps patients um, recognize how much they're leaving on the table, how much they're not getting the benefit out of their insurance company, and stuff like that, which, by the way, I feel like I
You
now
had
have to
heard
take
about
your
this,
ethics.
but it's actually called something when you're describing, it's called loss aversion bias. So it's like classic, yeah. Like the classic example, I mean, that I know of loss aversion is from like Dan Ariely, who I think is a great social psychologist. And he gives an example. The example is that he used to teach at MIT and he put a table out with two different types of chocolates. One of them were Lindt chocolates and the other one were Hershey Kisses. The Lindt chocolates he was selling for 15 cents a chocolate, and the Hershey Kisses he was selling for 1 cent a chocolate. And he found that more of the students chose the Lindt chocolates because they were better in terms of quality and they're just better chocolates. But then all he did was remove or at least lessen it by 1 cent. So now the Hershey Kisses were free, but the Lindt chocolates were 14 cents. And rationally, people should still buy the Lindt chocolates more than the Hershey Kisses because if you're willing to pay 15 cents, certainly you should be willing to pay 14 cents. But they found the opposite, that when something was free, the Hershey Kisses, a lot more people went to the Hershey Kisses. A lot of people are afraid or there's an irrational fear of loss, of losing money. That's why people make mistakes when they invest in the market. Fear of loss. You're not supposed to freak out when the market is tanking. but a lot of people make those mistakes because of loss aversion bias. Yeah.
Right. I think on that topic, Warren Buffett, or maybe it was his business partner, one of them once said that, like, somebody asked him a question, what's the hardest thing about investing? And he said, sitting around and doing nothing. That's the hardest thing. And the analyst is like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, look, he said something like, any idiot can put money to work, or he said something like, almost any idiot can put money to work. The real geniuses have figured out how to just sit around and do nothing, because that's all you got to do, which is so counterintuitive to what we believe.
Like Dan Ariely, I think, mentioned like locking himself out of his phone when the markets are going down so he can't do anything. Meaning, like, you have to create situations that prevent you from acting irrationally. So sometimes you got to kind of force yourself to not make that dumb decision.
If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and RCM works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.